Commission. I'd like to testify and over.
First, give us your address.
Pardon?
First, give us your address, please.
Yeah, I'm sorry. 4022 Downing Street, Annandale, Virginia, 22003. I'm testifying on my own behalf today. I have previously testified on previous IRPs about the deficiencies in the IRP, that most of which continue in the 2013 IRP. So I'm not going to go into that today. I want to focus on one issue, and I will try to briefly summarize my testimony here, of which I've handed in copies. I want to focus on the issues that have been raised, I think, by the recent analysis by the PJM system called the, I'll call it the PREAS. It's the PJM Renewable Integration Study. Perhaps the Commission's familiar with that, but I wanted to draw your attention to some of the important conclusions from that study that I think give a different picture of the role of renewables in the grid, overall grid system, of which, of course, Dominion is one member. One of the excuses that's been used to defend the lack of wind and solar power in Dominion's plans is that those are intermittent and not dispatchable, so they cannot be relied upon. And moreover, they've argued that large amounts of backup conventional power plants would be required to be available to pick up the load from wind and solar when it is not available. But that rationale fails to look at the situation from a systems view of how the grid could be operated. And for that reason, I think this new study by PJM is extremely important, because it does take a systems point of view. It's a very thorough analysis of operation of the grid under realistic conditions of actual load for 3 years and of the availability of renewable energy during that period. And it gives us a very different view of how renewables would fit into the system. So let me just point to what I think are a few key conclusions. The study findings in general support the notion that PJM's system, with adequate transmission and ancillary services, will not have any significant issue absorbing the higher levels of renewable penetration considered in the study, which were up to 30% of generation. Higher penetrations of renewables resulted in substantially lower emissions of pollutants and greenhouse gases, which is very important for the issue at hand of how we're going to comply with EPA regulations on carbon in the future. It resulted in lower system-wide production costs, even after adjusting for higher transmission costs to accommodate the renewables. There was no unserved load and minimum curtailment of renewable energy production in the extensive scenarios studied. Wind and solar contributed a positive value to the grid, which was on the order of $50 per megawatt hour, or 5 cents a kilowatt hour, even after allowing for the added cost of additional transmission and maintenance. There were several other conclusions that I draw from it that I won't go over in detail, but I just wanted to point out that there was a supplementary analysis of demand response measures and electrical storage, which suggested that demand response and storage could improve system outcomes and replace cycling of fossil fuel units with a reduction in PJM total production cost. And I also would note myself that studies by the U.S. Department of Energy about storage, in particular battery storage, suggest that the cost of utility-scale battery storage is expected to sharply decline over the next few years. And I believe they projected it will reach grid parity by 2020, which is well within the time frame of this IRP, in areas of the country that have high electricity costs, which is not necessarily our area, of course. I also want to point out that one of the arguments is about capacity factors. and I put tables in here which I won't attempt to summarize here, but the press looks at capacity of renewables in terms of a measure of the ELCC, or the effective load carrying capacity. And that, instead of using the factors of firm capacity that Dominion puts in its IRP, and that measure, ELCC, results in taking account of the correlations between the availability of renewable energy and the load. And just as one example, I'll point out, offshore wind in Dominion's IRP is listed as having a firm capacity factor of only 17%, whereas if you look at the ELCC of offshore wind in the PJM study, it's 33%. So it's a considerable difference. It makes these things look more attractive, even though these are different ways of measurement. So I won't say any more about that here. The PRIS study, the PJM PRS study, suggests, at least, the results of it suggest that Dominion has not given adequate consideration of or assigned appropriate value to the contribution that wind and solar could make to the grid. Since they could substantially reduce emissions of both carbon dioxide and conventional pollutants, those sources would especially be valuable when forthcoming EPA rules reducing carbon from existing power plants are put into force. So we need to look at the future. I also want to point out that a side issue here in regard to the argument over release of redacted information. As an independent analyst, I do not have access to the redacted information, of course, and it has a very constraining effect on my ability, and I'm sure lots of other people, to analyze and evaluate what the IRP has actually done and its assumptions, and I'll just give you a couple examples. When I want to know, well, what did they really assume for carbon dioxide costs, I have no idea. And I'd point out also that in the previous IRP analyses, they had a low carbon, I think a base case, and a high carbon cost. They leave out the high CO2 cost. But since I don't know what they assume, I don't know whether that has any significance or not. But what is clear, and so I would second what a lot of other people have said, that I think it's vital to the public interest that the SCC adopt the recommendations of your hearing examiner to make more Dominion's and other utilities' financial assumptions publicly available. We just can't really evaluate what's going on without that information fully. It is clear from the available information that DVP did not incorporate a high CO2 cost beyond their base case, and secondly, that whatever cost of CO2 was incorporated into the base case was not sufficient to make even the modest amounts of wind and solar appear cost effective. So one has to be suspicious about their assumptions of both the costs and the costs of various types of wind and solar generation. In view of the study results, I believe DVP should be required to revise their analysis of plans and incorporate much greater amounts of wind and solar power, along with higher amounts of demand response and energy efficiency through the DSM programs. And the analysis should reflect future CO2 emissions and take into account the possibility of the CO2 rules promulgated by EPA, especially after they become available. Waiting until the next IRP analysis of 2015 risks taking non-optimal actions on system expansion, including missing opportunities for initiation of expansion of wind and solar generation, including distributed solar generation, which also has a very high value in the PJM analysis, in part because it is geographically diversely distributed so that all the wind, solar doesn't go under a cloud at the same time. It increases the effective capacity of distributed solar. Finally, my conclusions are that a delay in beginning to reduce CO2 emissions will make the task of mitigating climate change much more difficult and expensive. Ultimately, DVP ratepayers may suffer higher costs from that delay, and as well as higher impacts from climate change. I therefore strongly recommend that this and future IRP plans drastically change their focus to concentrate on plans that make substantial reductions in greenhouse gases from electric generation. I don't think a goal of 30% renewable wind and solar power within the 15-year time frame of this IRP is at all unreasonable, but it's certainly a target that should be seriously considered and quantitatively evaluated. Also, energy savings from greatly accelerated DSM programs, more demand response programs, possibly increased electrical storage from new technologies as they become available, would reduce the amount of fossil capacity required to meet peak loads and assist in the task of providing frequency regulation and other services. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ball. Any cross? Hearing none. Thank you, Mr. Ball.